Okay, so thanks for introducing the workshop, Hedda. As Hedda mentioned, my name is Nikki Furlan. I'm the Community Engaged Learning Coordinator, Indigenous. And this week, we're going to look more closely at another one of the 7 principles of Indigenous community engagement, which is protocol. So as always, we start our sessions with a bit of a story to share our own personal experience with this particular topic. So I'm going to launch right into that. So this story is actually about time that I spent in Indonesia. So back in 2011, I graduated with a BA in Human Rights from the University of Winnipeg. And I was offered an internship in Indonesia with the United Nations country office in Jakarta. So as part of that work, I attended a week-long pre-departure training in Ottawa. And part of the training included meeting one-on-one with what was called a cultural navigator, or a mentor essentially. And that this was an Indonesian woman who was now living in Canada and who did this as part of their work with the government. So that it was that woman's role essentially to answer questions we had about like extensive country research that we had compiled, to talk to us about like everyday life in the country and sort of help us set some expectations about what those internships and living in another country would look like. And maybe most importantly, to share some protocols, which in Indonesia included, you know, how to dress, how to point, how to pass people different items, how to show gratitude and give gifts, even how to shake hands, how to start meetings and give feedback. And there was lots of them. And so, you know, we happen to assume that our own culture's protocols are common sense or, you know, normal. But they're actually just a set of behaviors and ways of being that differ from one cultural group to the next. So there are lots of protocols that guide daily life daily interactions and daily life in Indonesia, particularly in a business context, which is, you know, why I was going there to work. So failure to follow these protocols was considered super disrespectful. And, you know, because of the nature of the role that I was filling, could actually even really impact relationships between the government of Indonesia and the United Nations office. So it was really important that, you know, we knew about protocols and followed them. So I spent a lot of time observing, like watching the ways that people interacted and mimicking their behavior. And eventually those things became part of my personal and professional protocols for the year that I lived in Indonesia. So I just wanted to acknowledge too that during that time that I was there, I made a lot of mistakes, particularly, you know, in the first couple of months of being in the country when I was still really learning. And trying to change my behavior actively and adapt. But because I had developed my literacy in Indonesian protocols, because I had established strong, lasting relationships with my colleagues and others, and because importantly, I had the humility to acknowledge my mistakes and fix them, we were always able to get past those errors, right? Those mistakes, those kind of gaps in protocol. So we're going to talk more today about how to ensure that we, you know about and follow protocol. But before that, we're going to start by talking about what protocols are and why they're important. So what are protocols? Protocol, and again, you know, just a reminder, I know Hedda mentioned it, but all of the information essentially that we share with you has, you know, really kind of been drawn from our consultations with nearly 100 community partners and university faculty and staff. So we are essentially just reiterating, you know, our interpretation of what we heard from those folks. So protocols are nation and community specific governing systems that reflect the values, beliefs, and ways of life of a community and their relationship with each other, the land, and other beings with whom they share the land. So I think we have a tendency often to confuse or equate Indigenous protocols with ceremonies. So ceremonies do have like specific sets of protocols, but community protocols, what we're talking about here today, extend to what, you know, these day-to-day interactions that we might have with our community partners during community engagement activities. Indigenous communities often have formal and informal protocols in place for initiating and building relationships, showing gratitude, addressing conflict, parting ways, and many other situations. So really importantly, protocols are not one size fits all. So protocols differ between communities and might even differ between individuals living in the same community. So it's really important that we avoid a pan-Indigenous approach and make sure that we familiarize ourselves with specific individuals and community protocols. So you might remember if you've been with us for the last 7 lunch and learn sessions, but I told a story in the literacy session about passing tobacco to a community liaison who had been helping us arrange interviews in a Northern Cree community. And when I passed this tobacco, the liaison said, thanks, but I don't smoke. So she definitely knew what tobacco for, but it was a light chiding of my colleague and I that it was a reminder that it wasn't really appropriate to pass tobacco to everybody in the community, right? So later on that day, we actually passed that tobacco to another elder who followed those particular protocols. So again, this story is just a really good reminder that protocols of ways of doing things differ amongst, even members of the same community. Um, so it's important to become familiar with the protocols of people, groups of people, communities, and nations. Um, and so we have to do that work of familiarizing ourselves with these protocols of each of the new relationships that we're building. And in some cases, you can simply ask, right? We should have asked that liaison, that woman that we had been working with for a long time, if she would accept tobacco, or if passing tobacco was an appropriate protocol in her case, right? And we would have learned that it wasn't, and we would have corrected our behavior in advance and brought like another gift, right? That would have been more appropriate and appreciated. So these things are a necessary part of doing that work before the work and developing literacy. So those are the kinds of things that happen, kind of here up at the beginning in stage 1 of the work before the work on our pathway to Indigenous community engagement. And obviously, building our literacy continues throughout all 5 stages. So why do we need to follow protocols? So historically, universities and researchers have failed to recognize the importance of following protocol when working with Indigenous communities and when working on Indigenous land. And when we fail to learn about and follow community specific protocols, we're essentially demonstrating to the community that we believe settler ways of working, or our own ways of working, are not only the right approach, but the only approach to working together. And then when we use a pan-Indigenous approach, like my story essentially demonstrates, we're showing our lack of regard and recognition for distinct sovereign Indigenous nations and individuals too, right? So if we carry these kinds of colonial attitudes that say, hey, like our own way of working, our own cultural protocols are more important than your own, we shouldn't expect to be trusted or welcomed into Indigenous communities. Continuing on to why we should follow protocols, because of this history that we have together, acknowledging and following protocol is an important marker of respect and trustworthiness. So when we recognize and follow protocol, we demonstrate that we've done the work before the work of learning about community values and ways of working, and we're now approaching that community with respect and humility. And engaging in protocol also shows that we can respect Indigenous ways of knowing, being, and doing, and that we're willing to move beyond our own personal and institutional protocols. So rather than perceiving these community protocols as like a hindrance, as like these extra steps that I have to do, we should instead try to understand that engaging in protocol is actually what makes collaboration with Indigenous communities and universities possible. So they're not just these extra steps, that they're these really important steps, right, in our pathway of building relationships with each other and working together. Okay, so how can we ensure that we're following protocols? There, based on the consultations that we did, we were able to kind of distill what we were hearing into these like 4 key areas. So firstly, do your research. Make sure that you're doing that work before the work and developing your literacy in community protocols, specifically for the people and communities you're working for. So again, you might be familiar with protocols of, for instance, Scout and First Nations, but the protocols of Scouting First Nation are going to be very different from the protocols you might apply if you're now going to be working with Norway House Cree Nation or Nisitchewayasik, right? Like, so it's like you need to make sure that you're doing the right research for the particular communities that you're working with instead of applying like a pan-Indigenous approach. Secondly, find a mentor or cultural interpreter. So again, in my story, this was provided for us. At the time, I didn't even realize that this was something we needed, but looking back, meeting with that Indonesian woman when we were doing our pre-departure training in Ottawa was such an important part of our learning process. So it's one of the best ways to familiarize ourselves with the community specific protocol is to actually work with a mentor or a cultural interpreter, somebody or several people who agree to take on an educative role. So not just somebody you're constantly emailing about, hey, how should I do this? But somebody who's agreed to help you and to find these things out or has this information. So these cultural mentors and interpreters might be elders or knowledge holders. It might be your community liaison, or like a local coordinator. It could be like young people from the community, or even like, you know, a colleague who happens, you know, who maybe has relationships with this community or is from the community. But it's really important to remember that these folks are sharing their time and energy on our behalf to play that education role with us, to, you know, to teach us about what appropriate protocols and other information are. So we have to acknowledge that, we have to engage in reciprocity, and we also have to make sure they're remunerated properly. So we don't want to expect people to take on this role and the emotional labor of teaching us and answering all our questions without, you know, making sure that they're being properly compensated. And, you know, that might be giving gifts and food and money and whatever. So third, learning through observation, experience, and relationship are important ways for us to recognize and follow community protocols as well. So, you know, go to the community events, watch how people are behaving. This is also, you know, like if you're attending ceremony, like rather than asking a lot of questions, just watch the ways that people are behaving. You know, and if you still don't know what's expected of you, just sit that one out and help and participate in different ways. And if you're unsure about how to behave, and if there is space, you can ask questions without being intrusive, you can do so. But it's an important reminder, like not to center ourselves or impose our needs onto community members, in particular if it is like a ceremony or another important event in the community. We don't want people to have to center us and answer all our questions and teach us how to behave properly when there's all these other things going on. So, and then finally, learn from our mistakes and keep trying. So, you know, we're bound to make mistakes. And as we're learning about protocols and as we're learning about Indigenous community engagement as well, just more generally, even when we should know better, we still make these little gaffes. Like I've been working now in specifically Indigenous community engagement for about 11 years, and I still make mistakes, right? But the important part is how we overcome those mistakes. So in my experience, community lets you know when you've messed up. They're going to be very direct, or they're going to, you know, gently chide you, or they might tease you in a more like laughing, sort of like soft way. But regardless, they're giving you feedback about the way that you behaved, that it's not appropriate or something, right? So I think it's up to us, you know, as folks working within these institutions who want to be working with Indigenous communities, to learn from our mistakes and then do better. So there's been lots of occasions where I've been super embarrassed, really uncomfortable about my own behavior, frankly, right? But rather than, you know, fading into the background and not returning calls, and you know, you make an effort to fix your acknowledge the mistake, fix it, repair the relationship. And doing those things actually demonstrates to the community that we care. So we've got a couple of stories to tell here, which is what these photos are. So I'm going to tell a story, and then Annie's going to tell another story too. But so actually, during the consultations for this project, Annie and I showed up at a Northern First Nations community, and we showed up empty-handed to this big meeting. There was like 10 folks, and you know, we hadn't brought anything. We had just come from like Tim Hortons. We were carrying our own coffees, and we sat down for this meeting, and the group immediately, you know, teased, like very directly was like, where are our donuts? you know, and Annie, I remember like looking at Annie and I was just mortified. Like, I was like, how could we have messed up so badly? But, you know, we got through the meeting. It was a good meeting. You know, chatting with very direct folks. Wish we had some donuts to soften some blows, but anyways, on our way out of the meeting, the community actually invited us to stick around for lunch. One of the staff had made this moose stew, so we gratefully accepted. And you know, while we were having lunch with folks, really the dynamic of the meeting changed. Like, folks started telling us much more personal stories, and you know, we were getting some, like, you know, we were building relationships with each other essentially over this food. And we realized when we left, Annie and I were like, now we've established this relational accountability that we've been talking about for the last couple of sessions, right? So we were like, we've got to come back here, we've got to do better, we've got to repair, you know, these mistakes. So we actually returned a few months later to share some like early feedback about the project, and to essentially to do a report back with them about what we'd heard. And this time we brought coffee and donuts and we made lots of jokes about it, and they invited us to stay again for this super delicious fresh fish fry. But, you know, I think that it's a good reminder that, like, often in those situations, like, I know that I felt immediately like I wanted to defend my actions when they were like, where the heck are our donuts? They were joking, but they also weren't joking, right? Like, part of the thing, again, it's going back to reciprocity. What are folks getting out of these meetings we want to have with them, right? Like, they didn't believe that we were going to change our behaviors and that things were going to change so much in the community from our consultation. So they were like, we at least want to get donuts out of this, or some food, right? You know, it doesn't have to be donuts, but I know that, you know, my immediate reaction is wanting to defend my actions. But instead we just acknowledged the mistake, and then we did better. We fixed it. We went back a couple months later and we brought food. And so anyways, that's my story. And I know Annie has a story that she wants to tell right now too.
Oh, just very quickly, another example of getting feedback. So that one was very direct. We knew we had done something wrong. This one, Nikki and I were actually visiting in another Northern First Nation community. We were there for a powwow, and we were driving in a car, like on one of the days, and trying to plan out lunch. And so we had these hot dogs that we needed to cook, and I was driving, and one of the community youth was sitting next to me. And I just said, oh, do you think we could maybe cook the hot dogs on one of the fires? And the youth, there was this like moment of like awkward silence, and the youth, like in the most gentle and soft voice ever, said, well, those are sacred fires, so maybe we shouldn't cook the hot dogs there. And I just felt mortified because that's absolutely not what I meant. So there was another awkward moment. And then I said, of course, I don't mean the sacred fire. I mean the campfires that people had around. And the whole car, I think I was the only non-Indigenous person in the car. The whole car burst out in laughter because they're like, thank goodness this Chinese lady who's coming to our powwow doesn't want to roast her wieners on the sacred fire. But it was just like a really good reminder for me in that moment of like, you know, feedback from community might be very gentle. Also the way that people communicate, it doesn't have to be shameful either, right? That people were very ready to laugh, and as long as I could laugh with people, it wasn't a shame. I didn't feel shameful. I was just like, oh, I can't believe that this is what people think. And it was good to learn from it. And it was very gentle feedback. I think the youth was very brave to say it to me. Can be very hard to give feedback to an older person in your life. But it's a memory that will stick with me as kind of that example of different ways that community will tell you what you need to know and make sure you don't make very big mistakes.
Thanks, Annie. So I mean, again, I'm sure that, you know, if we've been working with Indigenous communities, we've likely made these mistakes in protocol. So maybe that's something we can share later in the community engagement advising hour. Folks can talk about, you know, some of the mistakes they've made in ways that they've overcome them, because that can be really helpful for others. So next, and I actually think this is our last slide before we go into our reflection period, but we heard in the consultations that there are a couple, really commonly overlooked protocols, but there's some of the most important ones. And they end up sort of, being in stage 1 and 3 of our pathway here. So one of them is initiating communication with an Indigenous community, or like that initial engagement, right? That there's a lot of protocols that are around that side of things. And then on the other hand, saying goodbye properly is an important protocol too, right? So, and that sort of happens to be on the other end of our pathway. So this first commonly overlooked set of protocols involves how to properly initiate these communications with Indigenous nations. That's, including scheduling meetings, getting permission to visit or work on Indigenous land. So during the consultations, we'd heard a story about a graduate student who was doing conducting environmental research, and they wanted to conduct environmental research on reserve. So they ended up going into this community, essentially sneaking into this community to take samples from ditch water. And so in their mind, the research was going to benefit the community. It was going to show that, like, whatever, that the water wasn't healthy or whatever, in a way to sort of help this community argue for like a better water system. But what they did was they decided that they wanted to skip the step of getting the community's permission to go collect these samples. So they effectively snuck into this community. And this youth knew all about OCAP principles, the ownership, control, access, and possession, First Nations research guiding protocols. So they were aware of these things. They were aware that there was an expectation for them to contact chief and council to let them know that they were coming to visit, but they were concerned, I guess, about that the community wouldn't want them to do the research. So rather than just not doing the research in that case, they thought, I'm not going to even ask permission. I'm just going to go do it. So this story, like, I think really demonstrates that it's like when we don't follow these protocols, we're demonstrating a lack of respect for Indigenous sovereignty, governance, and protocol. They also, I think, thought, well, I'm not working with people, I'm just collecting ditch water. And that also demonstrates, I think, a really lack of understanding about Indigenous land, right? And the relationship that Indigenous people have with their land. So, and then on the other hand, the other commonly overlooked set of protocols has to do with saying goodbye properly. And that's, whether you're saying goodbye temporarily because your program cycle is ending for the year and you won't be back until the next year, or more permanently because your program is closing. So saying goodbye to an Indigenous community partner requires that we honor the knowledge, time, and relationships that we've shared with the community and our community partners and other folks in the community too. So each community has its own distinct set of protocols, but we did hear commonly that gift giving and feasting were common ways to common protocols for partying in good ways. So I think Annie has another story here. I'm gonna mute my mic.
So a couple of years ago, we were closing a program that we had with partners in Belize. And we have a local coordinator that we work with there, but they come from a different area, region in Belize than the community that we work with. So the community that we work with is in the south, and the local coordinator was actually in a community in the north. And so I actually spoke to the coordinator. I knew enough that I should talk to someone there to ask what should be done, and I did. So I spoke to the local coordinator to ask, and their feedback was, it doesn't have to be a big deal, just kind of do your own private gestures to say goodbye to the individuals in the community. And I said, oh, that makes sense. I don't think we're that important, and we can just do these private goodbyes. When we got to the community, though, so it was our last program year, and I did let people know in person that we wouldn't be continuing this particular program trip. It definitely it caught people by surprise, first of all, and then what ended up happening was that they had to rush to organize a goodbye event, a farewell event, and they I was surprised by it because I, hadn't really prepared for something like that with the local coordinator. And we ended up having this evening where we exchanged gifts with each other, and people, shared words. They had gathered the community together, and there was a lot of crying. I felt very, very grateful and humbled by what they were doing. And most of all, I felt really surprised. And what I learned from that was that we have this tendency to work with someone that we think is local, but are they actually local? Do they live in the community? Are they a community member that you work with? Are they part of the kind of like frontline work that you do? Because only the people that you directly work with in the community can actually tell you what is the right protocol or ritual or ceremony that would make closing a partnership or project feel good for them and be the right way to do things. And so it was a really big learning moment for me. And I came back, and Nikki and Hedda can probably remember how I was just so overwhelmed by both the gestures of that evening, but also that I hadn't like prepared myself for that. And I think that was a really big learning from that time, and those consultations that go into this framework was it matters to community, and we can't assume things, and we also can't assume that who we think of as a local coordinator is who the community would consider like giving their own voice and opinion about something as well. So
Thanks, Annie. And that was a good point too about, making sure that we're actually working with local coordinators. And we heard that in several communities that we consulted with. So just a final note on this overlooked protocol of, saying goodbye properly. That it's important to note that when we say goodbye, we still have relational accountability with the community. So we have these lifelong responsibilities to reciprocate what we've gained while engaging with Indigenous communities, and saying goodbye doesn't end those obligations and responsibilities that we have. So you might also remember a story that I told in the relationship session about a month ago about how relational accountability is lasting as well. So this took place during this stage 5 relationship after the work part of this pathway, where the program and the partnership had been closed with the partner, but we were sitting down consulting for this project, and the community partner said to me, where were you when Thunderbird House's roof was damaged? You've got to be there to help. The relationship doesn't end when the project's over. So it had happened outside of, the confines of our project, but their expectation was that like we should have been there to, maybe help with fundraisers or provide some monetary support. And I agree that we should have. And it was just something that I wasn't even sort of on my radar at the time. So it was a good reminder that, we still have responsibilities to our former partners, even when things happen, after this stage 4 closing the partnership, right? So that those obligations and responsibilities we have because of our relationship are lasting as well. So that brings us into our reflection period. So we've got hopefully about 15 minutes today. Actually, we can go into our group, but so today what we're going to do is brainstorm about the kinds of interactions, events, and areas of our community engagement that might have protocols. So in the small groups, Annie's going to put you into your breakout spaces, and you can essentially like list these areas of your own work where there might be protocols that would govern or guide those interactions, and then you can actually use these lists to guide conversations with mentors or your community partners about specific protocols that govern our interactions. So if you think of like, okay, well, first I would initiate communication, so it's like, what are protocols that might go along with that particular activity or interaction? So anyways, Annie's going to put you into your rooms now. She's put the questions in the chat, so you should have access to those. So we'll see you back here in about 15 minutes. I think Annie will give you a 120-second countdown, and then it'll kick you back into this room.
Okay, so I will just recreate the rooms so that people are just assigned automatically. And then when you get into the room, I suggest you like look at the questions and just take a minute or two to like jot down take a minute, jot down your answers to the first question so that when you discuss, everyone's kind of ready. And we're chattering a bit just so people who are leaving at this point, we have the accurate breakout rooms here. Okay, so I'm going to open the rooms now, and you should have about 5 people in your room for these discussions.